Good morning, everyone. It looks like we have a good number to start, and folks will join us as we move through the session. Great. Thank you all for being here, taking the time this morning to join us for this conversation, our final conversation. I will go through an introduction, and then we'll begin with an overview of today's agenda, and then the session led by Nadiya Ali. So let us begin, and folks will join as they come. So hello, everyone. My name is Asha Edwin, and I am an EDIR educator, researcher, and strategist working in community engagement, wellness, and change management. As we move into the last of three conversations looking at anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and Islamophobia in the settlement sector, I invite you to reflect deeply on the learnings from the series. As always, it is a great honor to be here in conversation with you all, looking at how we move from intention to action in addressing racial equity in the immigrant and refugee-serving sector. Before we begin, I invite folks to check in with themselves and their surroundings, notice any support that will assist you during today's session, including closed captioning, ASL interpretation, and French translation. Or it may simply be acknowledging how you're arriving in this space today. The session agenda for today will begin with my introduction, followed by a land acknowledgement. We'll then move into the session by Nadiya Ali, followed by a 5-minute wellness break, just to get moving or drink some water, whatever you need for yourself. And then we'll go into a Q&A discussion where participants will be able to ask some questions, as well as I have some discussion questions that will follow the session. In keeping with a community space, creating a healthy community space and ensuring that folks feel welcomed into the space, we ask that you respect how you're arriving today. Similarly, we ask that you respect how others are showing up in the space, recognizing our individual experiences and how that impacts and informs how we engage with and respond to different conversations, including what is happening in this world. So the second piece that we like is comfort and choice. So we ask that all folks mute their mics and that this space is your space. So the choice is yours to keep your camera on or off. Just note the session is being recorded. Questions and conversations. The chat is available throughout the presentation. I am monitoring the chat, but we ask that you please use the chat with us to ask any of your questions throughout the presentation. Or use the raise a hand function if something comes up and we need to make note of it immediately. As we prepare for today's conversation on racial equity and mobilizing inaction to action, I take this moment to recognize those who came before me. The land where I live and work is part of the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee people. I extend reverence to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who live, love, and care for these lands today and continue to fight for their right to justice and recognition. In reconciliation, we find ourselves propelled with the ability to connect and understand that we must not only imagine a more equitable future, but actively participate in creating one. Today's session will begin with an overview of Islamophobia and move into a critical discussion about some of the dominant and problematic myths surrounding Muslim communities. Nadiya's talk will speak to the importance of using an intersectional lens, leading us to think about how we engage with and confront Islamophobia. The session will follow up with practical resources and recommendations to support the work and efforts to promote anti-racism, equity, inclusion in our pursuit of social justice within the settlement sector and Canada. We dedicate the space to reflect on past and recent events of hate, discrimination, and racism, where hope may be lost and has the opportunity to be found. And with that, a guiding question for today is, how will you introduce and utilize an intersectional lens as you begin to confront dominant and problematic myths surrounding Muslim communities? I invite you to personally reflect on this question as we move through the presentation and into a discussion. I hope that this will offer everyone the opportunity to listen, learn, and reflect on how we contribute to enacting change in our organizations and communities. And I will now begin with an introduction of Nadiya Ali. So Nadiya Ali is a PhD candidate in sociology, specializing in anti-racism, community empowerment, and brings extensive experience in education, research, and community development to her role as the NCCM's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Specialist. Nadiya has also been part of a range of community-based research and programming initiatives across the Greater Toronto Area, including the Black Experience Project and the Migrant Resilience Project. Nadiya recently held a visiting fellow position at Suffolk University teaching in the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department. Currently, her doctorate focuses on exploring issues revolving around racialization, identity, belonging, and resistance. Please welcome Nadiya, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for setting the stage for us all. I'm happy to be here, and let me just start by sharing my deck and being conscientious about, speaking a little bit slower. I tend to speak quite fast, so I'll try to be conscientious for our ESL friends here. All right, let me share the deck. Hopefully technology is my friend today. Okay, so again, happy to be here, and I'm coming to you from the National Council of Canadian Muslims. We are a civil liberties and human rights organization that works to combat Islamophobia across the nation. And this talk especially is going to spend time understanding Islamophobia, like we discussed, but really emphasize the intersectional lens in the way we approach Islamophobia. So thank you for that guiding question, Asha. Intro has been done, so I'm not going to say much here. But besides that, then my work continues to look at the intersection of Islamophobia, anti-Blackness, and racialization. Right, that across my community action work, academic work, and my public education work, right, which is an interesting intersection. All right, in terms of what we should expect for today's session, again, I shall lay it out for us, but in a little bit more detail. We'll do a little work on foundation. We'll set the stage. So we're kind of reflecting on how we're entering this conversation, or continuing that reflection that was started earlier in this session. And then from then we'll move into the dynamics of Islamophobia, right? We'll try to understand, we'll try to work on an operational definition of Islamophobia, think about the dynamics of Islamophobia, and think about how Muslim communities are constructed in kind of popular discourse. Right? And from there, we'll move specifically into looking at the first intersection we're really going to tackle, right? In addition to gender Islamophobia, we're really going to look at the Black Muslim communities in Canada and try to understand anti-Black Islamophobia, all right, and how that in itself brings layers of forces together, right, interlocking oppressions together. And understanding those particular interlocking oppressions, it enhances our ability to really understand Islamophobia also, right, as a bigger force. And we'll end with discussion on allyship, resources, and what does it mean to meaningfully be in community and meaningfully support Muslim communities. Again, this is just reinforcing what was started already in terms of setting this learning space for all of us, but we want to center understanding and respect, right? We're all adult learners. This is more self-evident than anything else, right? In creating a productive learning space and enabling learning space. But more importantly, I would like to emphasize I statements, right? We're not going to be able to, at least in the session, directly engage, but you'll have the chat box. But as you're moving into the discussion with me, journeying into this discussion with me, I encourage you to really think about your location in relation to the material, right? Really reflect on that and sit with that. How are you entering this material? What pieces of this material feels uncomfortable, perhaps, is not sitting well, and reflect on your own social location to be able to kind of unpack that a bit. So however close or far you feel your lived experience is to what we're discussing, we find it to be really powerful for the learning to really be cemented when we're able to bring ourselves into the learning, right? And find ways to bring ourselves into the learning. So from that, we'll start with this simple graphic, right? So we show this graphic across sectors, right? When we deal with young learners, we show this graphic, and we deal with adult learners like yourself, we deal with this graphic, and we get amazing interaction and kind of starting the conversation, right? So if we just look at these graphics together collectively here, let's reflect to ourselves. So what messaging comes to us? Like what messaging is being communicated in these graphics? Right by each other, right? So if we start that conversation by just thinking about the different pieces of this image set, right? So we have shapes, right? There's one shape on one side of the wall. There's a few other shapes on the other side of the wall, right? We have the wall, right, which is a really important part of this image, and we have a particular opening in the wall, right? A very specific opening in the wall.
Sorry, Nadia, to interrupt. This is Rogue the interpreter. We have a consumer who's using the interpretation, but they can't actually pin me. So would it be possible for who's running tech right now to help Jennifer right now in the tech? Thank you.
I think it's been sorted. Thank you. Thank you for that. So continuing on, so those are the different pieces that we see, right? We see the wall, the shapes on both sides, right? And then we have circle, right? Mouth wide open, exclaiming, just be yourself if you want to make it through, right? If you want to make it through, just be yourself. And then the other side, we see another bubble that is communicating to the other shapes. I don't know what you guys are complaining about, right? So if we think about from circle standpoint, it did require circle just to be themselves to make it through that opening, right? Because that opening in the wall was made with circle in mind, right? So for circle, speaking from their own lived experience, but circle's worldview is limited to their own lived experience, right? Circle's naturalizing their own lived experience as the experience of everyone else. So if we think about the shapes on the other side of the wall now, right? If we think about triangle, what would it require for a triangle to make it through that opening that's made with circle in mind? What does triangle have to give up? What does triangle have to leave behind to make into that opening, right? And then let's say triangle, works to shed pieces of themselves off, right? Shed pieces of their corners off to make it through that opening where circle is. We can imagine then, how would triangle feel on the other side? Would triangle have, a big smile across their face, exclaiming, just be yourselves? Likely not, right? What it required triangle to get to the other side was literally the opposite of just being themselves, right? They actually had to put parts of themselves away to make it through an opening that was made without them in mind, right? Another piece we can pick up here is that for circle, they're likely to move in and out that opening without really feeling the wall, right? May not even think a wall's there. For them, they don't feel the friction of moving in and out, right? And we can easily extrapolate here to think about, the social structures around us. Right? For some of us, we feel the wall. right? Mobility requires conscious and calculated navigation, right? We're constantly thinking about how we're moving in space, how we're presenting, thinking about our spaces around us to be able to secure our own safety and mobility. But for other folks, right, the wall's not felt, it's barely felt, right? And that's because of their own social location, right? So this kind of leads us directly to the next piece of our discussion, where we look at social location, right? Really being able to have generative conversations when it comes to anti-racism, equity, and inclusion. We really need to center our own social location to the conversation, right? Because our social location will tell us about what's our blind spots, right? What pieces don't land have a lot to do with our social location, right? So for Circle, the wall is going to be something they have to really stretch themselves to understand because it's not part of their lived experience, right? Circle can move in and out, fly in and out. So for folks that are stuck, that can't move through the opening so seamlessly, that's, again, speaks to social location. So again, I invite you now to reflect on your own social location. Right? Let's reflect on our own social. Like these are some markers we can look at, but we can think about more markers, right? We can think about more social markers. But let's think about our social location around these markers at a minimum, right? Around race, class, religion, income level, gender identity, right? Language ability, able-bodiedness, citizenship origin, educational background, appearance, sexual orientation, and we can keep going on and on, right? You can map yourself out. And when you think about the coordinates by which you fit when it comes to these different markers. And then we can think about power, right? What are our power positions in these different markers in relation to hegemonic society, in relation to dominant society, right? Where do we lie, right? What pieces of our social location are enabling, right? Easily allow for our mobility. What pieces of our social location make us the triangle in the story, right? Where we have to leave bits and pieces of ourselves behind to move and make it through and secure our own safety, right? So if I do the exercise and think about myself, if I think about the pieces of my identity that are always at the forefront, right? I can think about race, religion, gender. Those pieces of my identity are very salient, right? And pieces of our identity that are salient say a lot about the society we're in, right? That's how pieces of our identities become salient, right? Because we're often reminded of it by the world, right? And you're reminded of pieces of your identity by the world because it's marked as standing outside of the hegemonic center, right? And those pieces you're reminded of as you move, whether you like to or not, as you move in the world, you're reminded of those pieces, right? But this is as equally important and arguably even more important for us to think about the pieces of these social markers, pieces of our identity that we're not often reminded of. We actually have to critically reflect on to really think about, right? Or it's only comes to us when other folks talk about it. And so in my case, I can, as an able-bodied woman, I don't really think about ability often, right? Unless I'm doing this active work or reflecting on my social location, right? Which tells me then I possess a lot of power when it comes to that, right? Because the world is made with able-bodied people in mind around us, right? So that's how, we do the work of understanding that I for sure have incredible blind spots when it comes to able-bodiedness, right? I don't see the walls without doing the conscious reflective work, without being in conversation, right? So we need to be able to really engage with both pieces of our location, right? The pieces that enable us, that allow us to move in and out of the opening, but the pieces that also, obviously those pieces are easier to keep in mind, the pieces that function as barriers in one way or another. So with doing that work, right? So I continue to invite y'all across the journey we're going to have this morning to reflect on how might your social location impact how you interact with others and how others interact with you or see you, right? So our social identities are made dialogically, right? Are made in conversation with the world and the people around us, right? And that's a fundamental aspect of social identity, social location. So with that in mind, with that foundational work, I'm inviting you all to reflect on your own social location, reflect on how you're coming into this conversation, and reflect on then what pieces are, the pieces that are, what parts of your social location make you circle-like, and what part of your social location give you the experience of triangle and the other shapes, right? So now we'll move into Islamophobia much more directly. So when we start a discussion of Islamophobia, it's important and I would say productive to think about how Muslim communities are constructed, right? In our dominant discourse and our popular discourse, the taken for grantedness of the way Muslim otherhood is constructed, right? And we can borrow this quote from Edward Said to help us in this thinking, right? Edward Said, the famed thinker, tells us the Muslim has long figured in the Euro-Atlantic consciousness as an insurmountable, vexing provocateur, carrying both material and discursive consequences. So what does this say to us? What does it tell us? It tells us that Islamophobia is nothing new, right? It may be, framed in language a particular way in the contemporary moment, and it may, in the way that Islamophobia operationalized, it kind of shows up is very context specific and time specific, of course. But the notion of the Muslim other, right? Muslim communities being constructed as problems, as problem peoples, as Sherman Jackson puts it, as insurmountable problem peoples, is something that has historical roots, right? It's nothing new, it has historical roots. And we can see it as Islamophobia shifts and moves and shows up in where we're located, right? So this is an important just backdrop, the historical backdrop to keep in mind, right? The idea of an insurmountable difference. And think about what it means to construct peoples as insurmountable, an insurmountable difference, right? In that, what's happening is you are essentializing cultural historical difference, right? You're making cultural historical difference as something essential, fundamental, and unchanging, right? And when you construct culture and history as fundamental, essential, and unchanging, in that process, you're racializing that community, right? You're constructing culture as if it's race, right? You're racializing a community there. And when you racialize a community there, and then we'll come to all sorts of problems and the way we engage with that community and those unknown peoples. So building off this kind of overarching construct of a vexing provocateur, insurmountable difference that colors much of the discourse around Muslim difference, we can think about the specific tropes that often come up, right? If we think about, the public discourse, dominant discourse around Muslim difference, right? Again, we said Muslim difference as insurmountable, as a peculiar difference, right? If we think about it, all difference is difference, right? The difference that's made into a problem is a political issue, right? That's a politicized problem. It's a conscious historical problem when a particular difference is made into a problem, right? We also can think about the dominant trope that Muslimhood is constructed as something foreign and alien, a perpetual foreign figure, right? Irrespective of the histories of that community we're talking about. We'll talk about it later on, but we know the first Muslim peoples that landed on these parts of the world, that came to these lands, were likely, enslaved West African populations that were brought through the transatlantic slave trade, right? So having this kind of trope as Muslim as a foreign alien immigrant, it doesn't speak to a wide sense of the history of Muslims on these lands, right? We also have, we'll talk about gender Islamophobia, but we have a dominant kind of gendered dimension to the tropes and caricatures that circulate around Muslim communities, right? The idea that Muslim men as inherently violent, right? This notion of Muslim men as this conquering figure, inherently violent, conquering, erratic, conquering figure, right? That's another dominant trope we see that circulates our public consciousness and comes about in different ways, right? And in opposition to that, right, in conjunction to that, we have the Muslim woman that's constructed as in need of saving, as submissive, as inherently oppressed, right? And those two tropes often move together, right? Move with one another, right? So you have this notion of save the Muslim woman from the Muslim man, right? Which has resulted in all sorts of work around empire and imperialism, right? With that trope. And then again, another dominant trope that we'll try to deconstruct in this session when we bring up intersectionality, that the Muslim communities as monoliths, right? The idea that Muslim communities as a singular community, right? As a singular community that moves a certain way, looks a certain way, has a singular history, right? That's part of the tropes that circulate, that's produced with Islamophobia and circulate, right? So pushing forward, all right, we have to really kind of sit with how the way we construct communities, the tropes that circulate in our public discourse have real life material ramifications, right? When we hold these tropes to be fact about communities, right, what happens is this ends up coloring the collective consciousness around who Muslims are, right? And then it probably results in tragedies like this, right? These are the most, we can argue, the most overt, right, manifestations of Islamophobia, right? We can think about the Quebec mosque shooting as an overt, violent manifestation of Islamophobia, right? Which constructs people, when you construct peoples as problems, as inherently violent, you're only going to produce violence, right? And then on the other side, we can think about, our London family, right? The attack that happened in London, right? Another overt manifestation of Islamophobia. But to really think about how Islamophobia moves, but in many ways, how any system of oppression moves, we can't simply leave the analysis around the most overt manifestations of said violence, right? Obviously, those require a lot of attention, as they should, but to really do the work of dismantling a system of oppression, and in our case, dismantling Islamophobia and challenging Islamophobia, we need to think about what are the pieces that we can't see, right? So if we think about this iceberg, the iceberg metaphor is a popular metaphor that's used to think about racism and systems of oppression, right? So if we think about an iceberg, maybe 10% of the iceberg is visible to us, right? The top of the iceberg is what's visible to us, right? Majority of the iceberg, arguably 90%, is submerged underwater, right? And we can think about systems of oppression in a similar way. The most overt forms, manifestations, are much more visible to us, more easy to identify. But the pieces that are not easy to identify is the institutional dynamics that perpetuate Islamophobic environment, right? The systemic dimensions that perpetuate the Islamophobic environment, right? The powerful ideas, right? The tropes we talked about communities that circulate our public discourse, that circulate our public consciousness, that work as fuel, right? Generative, they have generative power. They work as fuel to continue to produce the most overt violent attacks that we see. So when we see overt violent attacks and we're asking, why does this keep happening? In many ways, we're not looking underwater, right? Because for that to happen, a lot of other things are happening, right? The ideas are continuing to circulate unchecked in many ways, right? There's institutional and policy dimension that continue to circulate, that further marginalize and make Muslim communities vulnerable, that go unchecked, right? So from that bigger discussion, I want to, as we move through this section, I want to leave you with an operational definition of Islamophobia, a definition that you could run with, right? This definition of Islamophobia comes from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and they define Islamophobia as stereotype biases or acts of hostility towards individual Muslims or followers of Islam in general. Islamophobia can take the forms of individual acts of discrimination or violence against Muslims, or those who are perceived to be Muslim, right? And that's a really important part, and we usually pause there, those who are perceived to be Muslim. What this tells us is Islamophobia pulls other communities into the drama of Islamophobia, right? So Islamophobia doesn't simply impact Muslim communities, right? It impacts other communities that do not identify as Muslim, but they're pulled into the drama of Islamophobia, right? And we can ask, why are other communities pulled into the drama of Islamophobia, right? Again, we go back to the tropes that we talked about, right? The problematic ideas that circulate around Muslim difference, right? What happens with what Islamophobia does is it constructs a particular caricature of who the Muslim is, right? So there's an assumed caricature, right, that generates Islamophobia, that the Muslim looks a certain way, moves a certain way, speaks a certain way, right? There's the image of a brown figure, right, that's bearded or veiled, right, as a caricature that circulates around who the Muslim is, right, what represents a Muslim community. And the consequence of that, and that is the consequence of Islamophobia racializing Muslim communities, constructing Muslim communities as a particular racial trope, right? The consequence of that is other communities are pulled into the drama of Islamophobia. And case in point are Sikh communities. We know Sikh communities experience a high degree of Islamophobia, although they do not identify as Muslim, right? We know Rastafarian communities that wear some kind of wrap or veil or around their head get pulled into the drama of Islamophobia, right? So we need to understand that how Islamophobia ends up racializing the Muslim other, which means other communities get pulled into the drama of Islamophobia, right? Islamophobia can also produce systemic targeting or exclusion, as well as structural obstacles to equal opportunity for Muslims in employment, education, housing, and other areas of public life. And pushing forward, and now we're getting into the intersectional pieces to really disentangle how Islamophobia operates and shows up in the lives of Muslim communities. We can think about gendered Islamophobia, right? And gendered Islamophobia is a coinage developed by Jasmine Zine, a professor in Watford Laurier University. And gendered Islamophobia was coined to be able to speak to the particular violence that Muslim women, visible Muslim women, so Muslim women that practice some form of veil, experience in the public spaces specifically, right? We'll talk about this more later on, but it's important to understand the dimension, the type of violence, and how Islamophobia shows up for particular communities doesn't always look the same way. Right? And we have to be really attuned to pick that up, right? So in what spaces, right, Muslim women face the most Islamophobic violence is not always the same where Muslim men or folks that present a Muslim men face, right? And we need to understand how spatially and institutionally where violence is inflicted the most in which communities, right? Which intersectional communities, right? So for Muslim women, again, the public space becomes a particularly precarious space, right? A space that elicits a lot of tension and harassment and violence, right? Another piece around gender Islamophobia is that tropes and caricatures that follow Muslim women are distinct from those that follow Muslim men, right? The oppressed Muslim woman in need of saving, that trope, what it ends up doing is it constructs the Muslim woman as lacking agency, as devoid of agency, right? And if you construct any people as devoid of agency, you are dehumanize them in that process, right? Without agency, what are we then, right? So when we construct folks devoid of agency, when we don't historicize people's context, right? But we construct them as individuals devoid of agency, then we dehumanize them in that process, right? They become objects again, right? Fanon says, part of the work of race and racialization is we make objects out of subjects. And the moment you make objects out of subjects that were part of this, so we construct the communities as being particularly vulnerable in one way or another. They become vulnerable to the attacks and violences that we see. So we'll move to our next section. I just want to leave folks with some numbers. I know numbers sit with folks in a different way sometimes than discussion. So I want to leave folks with some numbers, and I'm happy to share these numbers with our organizers. But these are some numbers from across different sources that try to capture sentiments, right? Sentiments or attitudes are not the only way to really think about the climate, but it gives us some sense, right, of the climate that Muslim communities find themselves in, or any racialized community find themselves in. So in terms of Islamophobia in Canada, right, we see that these are from surveyed responses. 46% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of Islam more than any other religious tradition, right? And this one has been replicated multiple times. Right? 56% of Canadians believe that Islam suppresses or oppresses women's right. Again, that gender trope we talked about, right? 52% of Canadians feel that Muslims can only be trusted a little bit or not at all. Right? So the idea of if you construct a certain community as a perpetual problem, as a threat, then trust does not extend to that community, right? 42% of Canadians think discrimination against Muslims is mainly their fault. This one's interesting because often we see in these surveyed kind of climate survey questionnaires, when folks ask about discrimination or racism, often what you hear is people kind of underplaying racism, saying, it's exaggerated, doesn't really happen, things along those lines. But the interesting thing is when surveyed responses are done around discrimination around Muslims, people don't necessarily feel like they have to deny it. they actually try to argue for it, right? What we hear is what people argue, well, I mean, if they're problem peoples, essentially, right? If you construct a certain people as inherently violent and problematic, of course they need additional surveillance. Of course we need to apply additional profiling, right? So whatever profiling, surveillance, and discrimination they're facing is mainly their fault, right? So that one's a particularly interesting one. It says a bit about the consciousness around the Muslim communities, right? 47% of Canadians support banning headscarves in public space, right? And often we know Canadians love making the comparison, the American-Canada comparison when it comes to race and race relations, right? But when it comes to, this survey, this was compared to 30% of Americans that felt banning religious symbols and headscarves in the public space was something that they would support. 51% of Canadians support government surveillance of mosques, right? Again, this goes back to the idea that profiling and surveillance around Muslim communities is mainly their fault, right? Because they're inherently violent. So of course we need to up our profiling and surveillance work, right? And again, this is compared to 46% of Americans, right? So as we're sitting with those numbers, and those numbers are a lot, right? And we can ask questions to those numbers, and that's fair. But it says something, right? It says something. It doesn't tell us everything, but it says something about the climate Muslim communities have to navigate in, make life in, and find their way through, right? So it says something about the broader climate that we should sit with and reflect on. So now with that kind of foundational work of understanding how Muslim communities overall are constructed, right? How Islamophobia racializes a particular image of Muslimhood, right? And understanding the broader climate and attitude around Muslim communities, we'll move into the Black Muslim intersection. And intersection is often erased when we talk about Islamophobia, right? But if we will look at it, it reveals a lot, both about the operation of Islamophobia and the application of anti-Black racism. So let's start with trying to understand the Black Muslim demographic, right? Who are the Black Muslim demographic? What makes up the Black Muslim demographic, right? So we know the Black Muslim demographic is composed it makes up about 10% of the Muslim demographic in Canada overall, but we know this number is underreported, right? And we know we have a problem with collecting these type of data, right? So these numbers I'm sharing with you are collected through community action, right? Community-based research, right? But we know the number is likely closer to 13-ish% or 15%. But in terms of official numbers that we have, 9 to 10%, right? That's the Black Muslim proportion of the Canadian Muslim demographic, right? And we know the Muslim population, again, this number is likely undercuts the population. The Muslim population is about 3%, a little bit more of the broader Canadian population, right? So that's in terms of the numbers. So Black Muslims make up a significant portion of the Muslim demographic in Canada. Just like we talked about when we think about Muslim communities, we need to consciously think about communities, right? There's many Muslim communities with different affiliations, orientations or faith tradition, different places of origin and connection, right, outside of Canada. We can say the same about Black Muslim communities specifically, right? So Black Muslim communities are not a monolith. Again, this is, if nothing else is taken from this presentation, the idea that we need to move away from thinking of communities as monoliths, right? But we know Black Muslim communities have various connections and places of origin, right? Including the African continent, the Caribbean, and folks that have been part of this land for multiple generations. In terms of distribution, the Black Muslim demographic is distributed in a similar way of a lot of racialized demographics, right? A significant portion of Black Muslims reside in the city of Toronto and the surrounding areas, but also other major kind of metropolitan places, Montreal, Quebec, Ottawa, Gatineau area. Again, take these numbers with a grain of salt. Another kind of rough estimate of thinking about, places of origin of Black Muslim communities, right? That we can say nearly 60% or 50%, but a significant proportion of Black Muslim communities are East African backgrounds, right? So that comes with specific cultural, ethno, and linguistic kind of affiliation. Nearly maybe 20% are West African background. Again, when you think about the range and diversity within that in itself, right? And over 10% would be associated with the Caribbean, right? So to give you a sense of the ethno-cultural kind of makeup of Black Muslim communities. So pushing on from that just demographic overview, so we know the population that we're talking about, we'll move specifically into anti-Black Islamophobia and what that shows us about the operation of Islamophobia. So we'll start again with, and we talked about intersectionality, but here we get to sit with it and have a definition to work off, right? So intersectional lens it's fundamental for us to take on to really understand how systems of oppression show up in the lives of communities and peoples, right? So we can think about system of oppression as kind of a big picture. We did that big picture definition of Islamophobia, but to really understand how these systems of oppression show up in people's lives, and then think about what supports can look like, what mitigation can look like, we need to take a intersectional lens, right? Which complicates the terrain. And I think that's part of the reason people kind of shy away from it. So we can think about intersectionality, right, which is a conceptual tool developed by Black women thinkers, how multiple oppressions and structural inequality exist in matrices of domination, which in turn reinforce unequal relationships of power amongst people. And such people and social institutions such as healthcare, housing, and the law, right? The big takeaway here is that the intersection, when we think about intersectionality, when you think about the differential access to power, right? In that differential access to power kind of construct a certain matrix through which you move in, right? Because of your intersectional identity. Right? So to really think about, the experience of Black women, you can't dissect Blackness and womenness, right? You have to be able to look at it at the same time to really understand how systems manifest around Black women, right? To really understand how systems manifest around Black Muslim women, you need to be able to take on all those dimensions, right? You can think about how anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, and sexism come into play in the lives, right, of Black Muslim women. So again, when we think about Islamophobia and think about how we operationalize as our support around Muslim communities and disrupt Islamophobia, we need to think about along intersectional lenses, right? And then different intersectional kind of pieces would show how different aspects of Islamophobia become amplified, right? If we think about the operation of Islamophobia, right? So we talked about how the way Islamophobia shows up in public space particularly impacts visible Muslim women, right? There's a specific dimension that really impacts visible Muslim women, right? If we think about how Islamophobia shows up in border crossings, right? In those spaces where you interact with the state and border crossing, we have Black Muslim men really being the case in point there, right? How extra level of surveillance and profiling follows Black Muslim men. So to really, again, understand how it shows up, Islamophobia shows up in people's lives, when you think about the different dimensions and institutions and how different pieces of Islamophobic operations become amplified because of the intersectionality that we're talking about, right? So this is a study that was done by the Institute of Islamic Studies connected to the University of Toronto on Muslim, and it was a survey that looked at Muslim experiences across Canada around Islamophobia and found Black Canadian Muslim women report the highest percentage of discriminatory experience, right? So across Muslim community surveyed, Black Muslim women reported the highest percentage of discriminatory experience across institutional landscapes, right? And if we really think about the triple jeopardy Black Muslim women experience, it's not really far-fetched for us to understand that why they would report the highest degree of discriminatory experience across different institutional spaces. But to really grapple and understand anti-Black Islamophobia, we do need to have some sense of anti-Black racism in itself, right? What anti-Black racism does, how anti-Black racism constructs Black bodies in a particular way, right? Constructs Black bodies as a particular kind of threat, right? This definition comes from Professor Ryerson. The professor writes, anti-Black racism includes policies and practices which are rooted in Canadian institutions such as education, healthcare, justice, that mirror and reinforce beliefs, attitude, prejudice, stereotyping, and or discrimination towards people of Black African descent, right? So it's a particular manifestation of racism, right? And if we think about anti-Black Islamophobia, right, existing in the experience of Black Muslims, we have anti-Black racism that constructs Black bodies as problems, right? And then we have Islamophobia that constructs Muslim subjecthoods as problems, right? Your way of being is what's made into a problem, right? So you have the context of the Black Muslim experience where your body is constructed as a problem and your way of being is constructed as a problem, right? So there's an amplification of how you're constructed as a problem in society. So when we think about anti-Black Islamophobia, like I said, we can think about it in this definition from a scholar, Delise Mugabo. We can think about anti-Black Islamophobia as a specific kind of racism and discrimination experienced by Black Muslims and the individuals who are perceived to be Black and Muslim. It also describes how Black Muslims become erased from dominant narratives about Muslim identity by non-Black Muslims and non-Muslims alike, right? So part of the working of anti-Black Islamophobia is erases Blackness from the Muslim story. Right? So when we think about how we affirm Muslimness, we highlight Muslim difference, often Blackness is erased from that conversation, right? So if we think about Islamic Heritage Month, and I've done a lot of kind of public discussions and education around Islamic Heritage Month, often the depictions, the conversation, the histories that are centered do not speak to the Black Muslim experience at all, right? So part of the work of anti-Black Islamophobia, it erases Blackness from the conversation of Islamophobia. This is just a graphic that I wanted to put out here. It was a study conducted by a Black Muslim woman, Dr. Fatma Jackson Best. Surveying is one of the few surveys that exist that looked at the Black Muslim experience in Canada, right? I did a literature review on the Black Muslim experience in Canada. So I just want to put it out here for folks if folks want to continue the learning. And the numbers around the demographic come from the survey. So what we're going to do now is to ground the learning further. We're going to walk through a virtual gallery together around that to think about how anti-Black Islamophobia shows up in the lives of Black Muslim communities. Right? So I mentioned this in passing earlier on, but it's important to go to ground the history, right? And to lay the foundation really clearly, right? We know the earliest Muslims in these parts of the land that we're calling Canada, right, likely came through the transatlantic slave trade, right? They're likely enslaved West Africans from the transatlantic slave trade, right? Historians show 30 to 40%, right, of the communities stolen from West Africa were of Muslim descent, right? They were practicing in secret when they came to this part of the shores, right? So when we think about the histories of Muslim communities in these lands, we really need to grapple with the transatlantic slave trade. And what does that tell us about the history of Muslim presence in this land, right? So pushing forward and thinking about some of the ways anti-Black Islamophobia shows up in the lives of Black Muslim communities, right? So if we think about just over-policing and Blackness overall, right, that's well documented, right? How Black communities are over-policed in a range of ways, right? And it cuts across ethno, cultural, religious differences, right? Black communities are over-policed in a range of ways, right? But when we think about the Black Muslim communities, you have the context of over-policing that's shared with other Black communities, right, Muslim or not. But we also have the context of surveillance, right? We have a different context layered on top of the everyday policing, right? So you have Black Muslim communities experiencing the everyday over-policing Black communities generally face. But we have that layered on top with the surveillance system that come at a higher level, right? So we have, security forces, interacting in these spaces, right? Security forces in suits interacting in these spaces, in addition to police officers in their uniforms, right? So you have a layered of how state forces coming into play in the Black Muslim experience. All right. So we think about, one manifestation is what happens when Black Muslim communities experience both over policing and over surveillance, right, at the state level. Another, manifestation of anti-Black Islamophobia is thinking about whose safety matters, right? Whose safety and whose life is given attention, whose safety and whose life is erased, right? So this is a study that came out a few years ago called Another Day, Another Funeral, that focused on the Black Muslim experience in the GTA. And the survey found between 2004 and 2014, the proportion of young Somali men among the city's homicide victims had climbed from 1.6% to 16%. But we know even with this climb, the resources, right? The resourcing needed to resolve these issues weren't really there, right? So we know even when you have the climb in homicides, a significant proportion of these homicides were left unsolved. Right. So what does this communicate to the community, right? What does this say to the community, right? What does it say about the safety, how their safety and security is valued by the broader systems? And another way we know anti-Black Islamophobia shows up is in the life of Black Muslim women, right? And we've seen a string of attacks experienced by Black Muslim women in Edmonton, in Alberta. And this is not the first time. We've seen on and off a string of attacks being faced by Black Muslim women in the public space. So what does this tell us? What does it tell us when Black Muslim women are become particularly visible and vulnerable in public space? Right, we have the play again of the intersectional, interlocking dimensions of anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, and gender violence happening at the same time, right, in the intersection or experience of Black Muslim women. We'll talk about the work done by Fazia Omar later on when we talk about allyship and amplifying voices, right? How Black Muslim women are speaking up and resisting and making their voices heard around the violences their communities has experienced. Another dimension of anti-Black Islamophobia, or another manifestation we can think about, is how, again, going back to the erasure piece, how the Black Muslim experience become erased in just Muslim narratives broadly, both by dominant spaces, but also in Muslim spaces that are not predominantly Black, right? So this survey and this study came out recently, really recent, a few months ago, done by the Black Muslim Initiative, right, in Canada. And they surveyed Black Muslims to understand what is their experience like in traditional Muslim spaces, right, or non-Black Muslim spaces. And this is some of the findings and the responses, surveyed responses that came out. So one participant says, oftentimes other Muslims have a hard time accepting that you're Muslim or know about Islam because you're Black, right? So we can think about how anti-Black racism kind of cuts across our society, right, in various communities, and it shows up in various ways. And the way it shows up for a lot of Black Muslim communities, it erases their Muslimness, right? And another piece to keep in mind is that this piece of erasure happens multiple times. It becomes a story of Black Muslims, right? So in tables around Islamophobia, Blackness is erased, right? At the same time, in tables around anti-Black racism, often Muslimness is erased, right? So you have this dual erasure that Black Muslims experience, where their complete experience, there's no place to capture their complete experience because they do not kind of fit pre-assigned boxes of where racialized communities are supposed to fit, right? So now, as we're coming, closer to the end of our discussion, we'll talk about what does it mean to disrupt anti-Black Islamophobia, and in that disrupt Islamophobia and build inclusive and safe communities. So as we, continue in this discussion, as you kind of leave this session, I want you to continue to think about, how might anti-Black Islamophobia, how might Islamophobia show up where you're located, right? And the work you do and the people you serve, how might it show up again? Thinking about definitions. Definitions are a good starting off point, jumping off point, but we need to do the intersectional work, the surveying work to really understand how it shows up where we're located. And then to be able to, think about what disrupting means. So now we'll watch this video, and this video, just a primer, speaks to the Black Muslim experience, but comes out of the attacks that were happening in Edmonton to Black Muslim women, right? So hopefully it would play and everything will be good.
It's exhausting. It's like you're constantly on like a fight or flight instinct whenever you're outside, which shouldn't be a thing.
Maybe this could be one step. Awareness and validation is always a good place to start.
I've always felt really proud of being a Muslim and being a Muslim Black woman, but there is a sense of fear every time I walk out the house, every time my mom walks out the house and my sisters.
I've been like publicly accosted, like verbally by individuals. It was very uncomfortable because I was just like walking downtown and I was just living my life, and people felt comfortable enough to make those kind of like statements. And it was very jarring because I was aware that others were aware, but I wasn't aware if it bothered others.
I was driving, somebody came in front of me and they just slammed their brakes. And I didn't think anything of it. I just thought road rage. But then they were following me. They kept doing it. They kept trying to get me to bump into them. I heard another friend of mine talk about that happened to her mother. And then another person. So I was like, oh my God, is that what's going on here? Is this what's happening right now?
When you see these attacks and you hear about them, it's just kind of shocking. Like, oh, everyone doesn't see me as their equals. They don't see me the way that I see myself with them. And so it just makes you like think twice, right? So it's like when I'm getting on the train, I'm like, oh, let me get on where everybody else is rather than being by myself on the first train.
We could be walking outside and walking like on the sidewalk, and there'll be like a person coming up behind us or a person walking past us. And I remember me and my friend, we would like grab each other's hands and like push us towards the other side of the sidewalk away from the person. Both of our shoulders would just tense up, and we would just be like very hyper aware.
We are part of this community and we live it here peacefully. So the things that are changing are quite scary. I know that my daughter was one of the people that got that attack, and still she's scared of going out. I think people have to hear our voice and have to hear that how this hurts.
I feel like because of those attacks and because of that, like that fear, it's important to speak up.
I think there's like an open wound right now when it comes to this topic. I believe that the city can do a lot more.
I think the politicians have some responsibility, the police have responsibility, the legal system has responsibility. I think media have responsibility to create awareness.
I think that we need to just represent who we are and not be afraid of it.
I think existing as a woman, as a Black woman, as a Muslim woman, as like just all the different identities I embody, I can't stop existing because of others. I'm going to exist and I'm going to live my beautiful life.
All right. So we'll push forward. And I encourage you to go back to Fazia Omar's work and engage with the work there. A lot of beautiful pieces came out. And the piece that's powerful about the work is that she's capturing Black Muslim women with a backdrop of public space. Right, saying that, you know, we all have the right to public space, right? And what does it mean to create a society where we all can actually have the right to public space, where we can move in public space without navigating, calculating what part of the streets we have to stand on. Right? So this is another project that focused on amplifying the voices of Muslim women broadly, but including Black Muslim women. It was conducted by Alia Yusuf, and it was called the Sisters Project, and actually gained a lot of media attention. So Ayana, she explains, one of the most challenging experiences of my life was understanding that as a Black Muslim woman, I will experience unnecessary hardship in the world because of how others may perceive my race or religion. When I was younger, I did not think of the space that I take in society and how significant it was. However, as I got older, I recognized microaggressions and how people shift their attitudes as they interact with me. So if we think about how our young folks are growing up in this world, right, and coming to know themselves in this world, and we talked earlier in the session how we know who we are in many ways in relation to the world, right? How the world responds to us and engages with us, tells us about our place in the world, where we are, how we can move in the world. And this is learned really young, right? We can talk to really young kids, and they know, they have really acute sense when they're racialized, that their otherhood is apparent in one way or another, which means they should move in space differently, right? We just learned this just to be able to survive and navigate space. So from those, we'll move into discussion of allyship and resources. What does it mean to ally with Muslim communities, right? Given this context, what does it mean to ally with Black Muslim communities, given this context? So we can think about allyship as a lifelong process. Again, a lifelong process, right? It's not a kind of a one act process, a lifelong process of building relationship based on trust, consistency, accountability with marginalized individuals or groups of people. Right. So when folks, are well-intentioned and they want to, do the work of allyship, right? Often folks don't really sit with the idea that allyship requires a certain level of commitment. Right? Allyship requires ongoing learning, right? Allyship requires just not kind of one act of charity here and there, right? Allyship is a process of us really grappling with our location, our positionality, our power, and think about how could we extend our power to in such a way where we can expand, the boundaries of inclusion. Right? So one way of doing the work of allyship is amplifying the voices of folks that are doing the work, right? So we may talk about these systems, all various systems of oppressions that the racialized communities face, but racialized communities are just not sitting there and waiting, right? They're doing the work to carve out spaces for themselves. They're doing the work of resisting and pushing back, right? And part of the work of allyship is not to reinvent the wheel, but to be able to locate those places, right? To understand what our community doing, what has been done in community, how could you support what's being done? Right? So how could you amplify and support folks like Fazia Armour they're doing the work of capturing their community, right? Showcasing their community in a way that perhaps disrupts caricatures and images that people have of who makes up the Muslim community. Just building off that, so meaningful allyship involves, like we said, reflecting your own privilege and power, right? That's the starting point, and that's almost a starting point, the middle point, and the end point, right? We have to keep coming back to the work, reflecting on our position, our social location, our privilege and power, and how when you think about social location, privilege and power is something that moves, that's fluid, right? There's certain parts of our identity that are in relation to the world that are likely not going to move, but there are other parts of social location that may move. For instance, our socioeconomic status, that may be something that moves, right? That may grant us different type of accesses as we move, right? Our educational background is something that may move, right? That opens up different kind of opportunities and privileges and power. So we need to be able to go back to this, right? To go back to understand we're full people that shift and move. So we need to continue the work of reflecting on our privilege and power and our social location, right? We have to be committed to ongoing learning and listening, right? Ongoing learning and listening, right? An hour-to-hour session is a starting point, but we have to be committed to ongoing learning and listening to understand how these things show up in people's life and be able to listen, to actively listen, right? Even when it doesn't fit our frames of how things should move and happen, right? Taking accountability, right? Often when we do these sessions, we hear folks feeling nervous or apprehensive of doing the wrong thing. So they don't know how to, they don't know what to do, how to start, right? But you just need to start. You need to reflect. You need to connect with the right people. You need to survey, understand what's happening on the ground, and you just need to start. And you may make mistakes, you'll slip up, but the piece is not being afraid of failure. The piece is, what do we do when failure happens, right? What happens now? What do we do then? Do we take accountability? Do we go back to our learning and listening, counting our privilege and power, or do we get defensive? right? So we need to keep in mind that intention and impact are two different things. Our intent may have been well placed, but it may have been received differently, right? The impact may not be what we expected it to be, and that's okay, right? We can sit back and say, okay, it wasn't received the way I expected it to receive. What does this mean? How could this be a moment of learning? How could I take accountability and kind of reflect on my provision power, what I missed, right? And then, of course, we spoke about this already, amplifying and supporting the voices of folks that are doing the work, right? We don't need to speak for anyone, but we can support them, providing the platform, lending our privilege and power for others to speak their stories, right? Because folks are ready, they're speaking. It's about us, are we hearing, right? So to kind of wrap up our learning wrap our learning here, just some takeaways, right? A biggest takeaway, and I mentioned this earlier, is that we want to disrupt the myth around a monolithic Muslim community, right? We really want to disrupt it. We want to disrupt the idea of a universal Muslim figure. There's no universal Muslim figure, right? And anti-Black Islamophobia really demonstrates that, right? It disrupts the idea of any universal caricature of who the Muslim is and how the Muslim looks, moves, things along those lines, right? So when we need to do this work, reflecting on how anti-Black Islamophobia might show up where we're located, the work we do, right? Understanding how racism stratifies populations, right? We understand just the operation of system of oppression. The operation of racism is it stratifies populations along proximities to whiteness, right? Right? In many ways, at the core of what we're talking about is white supremacy. That's what really holds to all these different manifestations, right? All these different racisms, right? So we need to understand how racism stratifies populations in relation to proximity to whiteness. And proximity to whiteness is measured both in an embodied sense, right? But also in the subjective cultural historical sense, right? So we need to understand where people fit in relation to proximity, right? So if we have language proximity to whiteness, that is a point of privilege, right? That's a point of opening, right? So there's different ways we can think about proximities to whiteness beyond just the embodied sense. Understanding that interlocking dimension of anti-Black Islamophobia means that Black Muslims become hyper-visible and invisible in particular ways, right? And this also speaks to gendered Islamophobia, right? Muslim women generally become invisible in particular ways and hyper-visible in other ways, right? And we need to be conscientious of those moments of hyper-visibility and invisibility, right? So the Black Muslim case, with Black Muslim women, they become hyper-visible in the public space, right? We know when Black Muslim, especially veiled Black Muslim women, move in the public space, they become hyper-visible, right? Which makes them particularly vulnerable in the public space, right? But again, we know Black Muslim communities become invisible when it comes to understanding systems of oppression. When it comes to tables around Islamophobia, they become invisible all of a sudden, right? When it comes to work around anti-Black racism, Black Muslims generally become invisible. So we need to understand the moments where communities become hyper-visible and invisible, right? There's different harm being done in both of those moments. And keeping in mind that anti-Black Islamophobia tends, like we said, erase Black Muslims, both from non-Black Muslim spaces and non-Muslim Black spaces, all right? And we need to grapple with that and understand what this means. Often the construction we engage with the world in, it's whether we kind of want to consciously think about it or not, is rooted in white supremacy, right? Whiteness in many ways shapes the way we see each other, even amongst racialized populations, right? And we need to be critical of that and reflect on that. If we're going to do the work of building meaningful solidarity and allyship. Right? And this quote is just a powerful quote. I want to kind of wrap with from Mugabe again, that defines anti-Black Islamophobia for us. Mugabe says, the Muslim subject is not always specified as Arab or South Asian, but is nevertheless treated in a universalist manner that forecloses any potential attention to the subject racialized as Black. So we need to pay attention to the implicit assumptions, right? Sometimes these things are not named, but there's implicit assumptions built into the way we engage with Islamophobia Muslim communities, right? And again, for just wrapping up, when we think about intervention, when we think about what it means to be an ally, we do need to do the work of thinking about what is our level of intervention, right? We all are located in such a way that we can intervene at different levels, right? We all can intervene at the legislative level, for instance, right? That may not be our social location, but we may be able to intervene at the individual level, at the community level, right? If we are people managers, or if we, you know, we do lessons like this, right? There's different levels of interventions, and all the levels of interventions produce value. So when you think about where are we located and what is our level of intervention, right? And in addition to level intervention, another frame that's helpful when we think about allyship is thinking about spheres of influence, right? What is our sphere of influence, right? Both in terms of social location and power, but also in terms of just the work we do, you know, our professional lives. What is our sphere of influence? And again, how could we impact change from our sphere of influence, right? Yeah, and I'll just end it with another Mugabe quote, right? Mugabe also says, although non-Black Muslims undergo a casting out from the nation or a place in the state or placed in a state of exception, right? The exceptional difference. Black people, Muslim or not, are always already casted out the category of the human and the category of the citizen. Right, and I'll just stop sharing and end it there. So thank you for your attention and walking with me in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Nadiya, for your presentation. I second the comments, very powerful and insightful presentation. And a lot of what you said, I'm actually excited for our discussion, has been shared in the comments or the chat box and ties in a lot of the questions I have to follow. So for the sake of time, we are scheduled until 12, and I do want to respect your time as well as all the supports in the session. So I ask if folks, we'll take like a 3-minute break in return for Q&A. In that, I will prioritize, of course, if there are any questions from the audience, prioritize those questions. Otherwise, I have a series of questions that I have drafted, and we'll weave in a lot of the great conversation that's been happening in the chat. So I ask if folks can return around, let's just say 11:20, and then we'll take the session, I imagine, right up until 12 o'clock in terms of Q&A. Thank you. I hope folks are joining. Excellent. Joining back. We'll wait for Nadiya. Perfect. Excellent. So I will just begin and folks can join in on the conversation. I do want to use our time wisely. So I want to open the floor first to any questions from the audience or participants. If you'd like to raise your hand and or write something in the chat, please feel free to do so. If not, I will get into the questions that I've prepared. Okay, so if folks have questions throughout the conversation, feel free to drop them in the chat or just raise your hand and I will make sure to loop it in and or call on you. So Nadiya, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, phenomenal presentation. I think brings us to a place of really putting ourselves in our work. And so I wanted to begin, as you were speaking, I drafted some additional questions. So I wanted to begin by setting the tone and asking or bringing back or starting with really a discussion on conscious reflective work that you spoke of. And I wanted to say or ask really, how do we engage with our social locations without feeling burdened by or not responsible for various conversations happening? We often hear folks say, but it's not my fault, I am X, and or if Y community would just. How then do we begin to move the conversation forward while at the same time being accountable to our actions and to the local, national, and international community, including when it is a challenge to prioritize the needs of others? We often see this in times of crisis, and really I'm focusing more comprehensively as it relates to or is juxtaposed with systemic racism.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. And that's a big one, right? And it also does come up often when we do this workshop, especially when these workshops get to be interactive. It comes up often when these workshops get to be interactive, and that's a real, that's a real question, right? What does it mean to do this in the everyday, in our own lived realities, right? So it's nice to kind of say it, but in many ways, I think that the frames we talked about near the end maybe do some bit of capturing that, right? If we do the work of social location, right? We do the work of critically reflecting on where we sit in the power kind of hierarchy across dimensions. Sometimes also, I think it becomes difficult and complicated when we're racialized ourselves, right? That just doing that mapping becomes layered, and also there's just general exhaustion of just living in the world as a racialized subject, right? So when we're doing the work of also, okay, now we need to understand all the other, all the other particular intersections, it can become a lot, right? So yeah, that makes a complete sense. But I think the work is really thinking about where we're located, really thinking about both in terms of our social location identities, but also in terms of our just professional location, about what levers do we have accessible to us, right? And that's a good starting point. So what levers do you have accessible to where you are? So you are kind of in terms of your professional life, maybe you're HR rep in a particular organization, and that's the lever point you have. That's maybe the point of intervention, right? So it's layered on top of the everyday work that you do. So you don't have to go out there and find something else that you can root yourself in, right? That's likely not a reality for a lot of folks to be able to do that, organizing work out there. But you can do something where you're located. So thinking about your level of interventions or where you're located, what levers do you have available to you, around you, that you can do something with, right? So I think that's what I would say. Start where you are. Right? Start where you are and start small. And for your case, it could be just starting those conversations with folks around you, right? It could be just the ongoing learning could be your starting point. But I think the big piece is not to be overwhelmed by the bigness of it all and just start where you are.
I love that. And it reminds me of something I came across around stories and narratives that we tell ourselves. And often they're highlighted by these predominating narratives or ideologies that exist in larger society. So this also ties in quite nicely to some of the comments around misinterpretation and a lack of knowledge of real Islamic teachings resulting into discrimination towards Muslims. And these are from the chat. Another one is poverty is a breeding ground of violence, and sadly, it is prevalent in communities struggling with poverty. And then one other comment before I move into the other question, which speaks of media and sort of these narratives or stories that we hear and then tell ourselves and live, and that live within us. And so they are exhibited and perpetuated. It's always about the mainstream media bringing on the miseducation. And so they also said, although newcomers will say they're not too bad now, i.e., because since the early 2000s, they were being bombarded about the way they report on Muslims. And so I wanted to ask, when we see violent and inaccurate narratives of Muslim communities in the media, we know this informs the broader community and incites harm against Muslim communities. What are considerations individuals and organizations, or what considerations do individuals and organizations need to take? And some critical counter narratives, I think that will be helpful, that individuals and organizations can use to challenge this in their work and communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for folks that were engaging in the comments. I got a chance to quickly look through it during our break. So great engagement. Yeah, so a big piece of it, yes, is just the fact that most of us consume a lot of our knowledge about other folks from the media, right? That for most folks, that is the everyday consumption, right? That we're consuming, whether we internalize it or not, images and representations of communities from mainstream media. So that has a lot to do with the way how things are circulated around us, how we get to know one another, right? Without ever having conversations with one another, right? But then, yeah, what does it mean to critically engage with that, what you see, with those representations you see, right? And from where we're located, especially organizational work, I would say because folks do come back to, it's a lack of education. And partly, yes, it is a lack of education, but there's more to the story than that, right? Because we know, recently I was invited to do a talk around talking about, speaking about hijab specifically. And the question around the talk was, why do the same kind of, repetitive question, why do Muslim women wear hijab? All right. And when I entered that space, my kind of first question is, why are we still asking this question, right? Just asking that question in itself is perpetuating similar myths, right? We're stuck in the same conversations. And when you think about who does these conversations serve, who does these representations serve? So if I'm spending all my time explaining to folks why I wear hijab, but people can't hear for some instance, all right, for some reason, because there's been tons of work by Muslim women explaining, the histories, the reasonings. But then we need to ask ourselves, it's not a lack of information out there, right? It's not really the lack of information. When you think about what is amplified and why are certain pieces amplified? What does that do? What work does it do either for the state, for empire, for our society? Why are certain tropes amplified over and over again? And then from where we are, it's about I think that was an organization that, structured that talk around why Muslim women hijab. And they were well-intentioned. They were trying to build space for folks to be able to learn. But it goes back to that question. By asking that question, structuring our talk around that question, are we simply perpetuating the same tropes and not really talking about topics that are really going to further the lives of Muslim women? Because that topic's not going to further the lives of Muslim women. Muslim women know why they wear hijab, right? So I think it's going back even to those pieces. Sometimes we don't see how we're replicating these tropes, even in the simple questions we ask.
Yes, I think that's key. That is great. And I do appreciate from that, we can really begin to think about how we position ourselves in this work and where we ask why. Like, why are we asking the why of individuals, while at the same time trying to promote and advance social justice, inclusion, equity, et cetera. So in that, and as part of this conversation, you mentioned that no community is a monolith. I think that theme carries throughout the sessions that we've been having. And I'm sure other folks in the chat have identified with this understanding of experience within the conversation of Blackness or the conversation of being a Muslim, et cetera. And so as we have learned, no one community is a monolith, often requiring confronting, challenging, and healing within and between communities. I guess for organizations and individual workers here or professionals here, how then do organizations work to support these efforts? And how can organizations support employees in navigating these challenges?
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, that's the theme we always also push in and all our learnings and our teachings, that we need to move past the notion of a monolith, because that's too simple, and people are not simple, right? Things are really layered and complicated. But in terms of on the support side and the work side, it does make our work layered and more complicated, right? It's not a kind of a one size fit all kind of situation. And many of what we need to do is we need to locate ourselves in the context that we're in. We need to do the surveying work with the context. Who are we serving specifically in the particular neighborhoods that we serve, and the particular kind of geographic locations we need to serve? I think that surveying work is a starting point, right? We can think about systems and how systems constructs people as a monolith and the consequences of that. But while we hold on to that and understand that, I think we really need to do the contextual just surveying work, really understanding that where we are, who we're serving, what is the makeup of the folks we're serving. And just that basic surveying work, even at the demographic level, I think opens up very particular opportunities of interventions, right? How interventions end up making sense in a very particular way for those folks. And another layer is just active listening. People do tell you what they need, but you need to be able to hear them, right? You need to be attuned in a way where you can hear them and understand and work through it, right? That's another layer too.
And with that, within the constraints of work, we often find it challenging for individuals, and it comes up where they're constrained by the parameters of their job, their organization, et cetera. How can they, or how can folks, and it's come up as a question every now and then, and I think people really think about, how do we move this conversation forward? How do I do better in my work? So how do folks then navigate within those sort of constraints where the system doesn't support the individual efforts to advance social justice or have these conversations?
That's a big one, right? And that is the real challenge that many of us face, right? Even when we're ready to do the work, right? Even when we're present, the structures are not really enabling, right? They're not really enabling for us to really do the work in creative ways. And that is a perpetual challenge. And in many ways, that's only, we've seen what happened in the past couple of years, right? And the shift that we've seen in critical consciousness, and all of a sudden systems kind of moving in a way that were argued to be unmovable before, right? So in many ways, to get to that point, it is that ongoing kind of continuous work of just it feels like bumping into walls. But those kind of, work of working in solidarity with people outside of the organizational structure, in the organizational structure, being able to build community internally to wherever you're located, right? Across different dimensions, folks that have different levers accessible to them, right? And being able to, perhaps pull levers at the same time will move structures differently than when you do it on your own, right? So it goes back, I think, even how do we build community internally, or organizational networks in a way that we're able to have some kind of critical mass internally to be able to, push things further.
I love that. I think that's a great takeaway for folks, is the internal sort of work and really thinking about the praxis of it all, right? Like, how do we actually engage with this work? How, as individuals, do we bring ourselves into the conversation and then build that community or those networks where exactly we stand?
Yeah, and just to add quickly, and you just reminded me of something. I've seen interesting work done by affinity groups and organizations in some of these conversations I've had. And for a lot of folks, these affinity groups are relatively new in organizational spaces. But being able to build solidarity across affinity groups and then seeing what opens up, right? How when you multiply that access and power, what opens up and what becomes possible. So I've seen that. So there is works to do that, but it is work, right? It is work, and it doesn't happen overnight.
No, it doesn't. And I think a great point you make about affinity groups, which often comes up in some of these trainings, and I think the foundational trainings that organizations have taken up the space around like equity, diversity, and inclusion, where affinity groups are perceived as being sort of negative or harmful to the larger context of an organization, where the opposite actually exists, and they actually make space for individuals, like you said, Black, Muslim women to exist and be, form a group, and then we work across affinity groups. And so really thinking about how safer spaces exist within organizations, both the necessity of them, but also what they can build in creating or facilitating or moving this work forward when we think about social justice, anti-racism, et cetera.
Exactly. And I think like you just said, and that's a really powerful point, the piece that's missing is that how it becomes opportunity for coalition building, right? Yes. It really becomes ripe opportunity for people to coalition building. People assume affinity groups mean that's it, I'm just talking in my, echo chamber, but in reality, it becomes jumping off points for coalition building. When people have a space to feel safe, feel included, that becomes ripe ground to think about how do we effectively build community across, right? And build real partnerships and meaningful allyships.
Right, and holding these organizations both accountable, and also the organizations then or leadership really holding themselves accountable to their objectives, their strategic planning, and not sort of like demobilizing or minimizing these groups, but rather empowering them, for lack of a better word, or amplifying, as you mentioned, amplifying their voices. And so that leads me into another question. I think it's a very important question, actually, and you pointed to this in your own learning and as you were speaking, and it's a reminder to me about ableism around speaking, speaking quickly, especially in sessions like this, thinking about the positions of others actively as we exist in this world. And so the question is around, given the diversity of Muslim communities and individuals who identify as Muslim, how can organizations and individuals confront lateral racism and oppression within the broader conversation of Islamophobia, considering points not raised, such as ability, disability, trans and homophobia, class and language, et cetera, sorry.
Yeah, right. It's always the etc.
It's always.
I like what you said about thinking actively about the positionalities we hold, and regularly doing that work. And in many ways, I think the work of the lateral piece, because often people kind of forget how complicated and layered the lateral work is. Right? Complicated and layered that the lateral work is, but it's work that needs to be done to really be able to build effective coalitions, genuine coalitions and allyships that can really move the needle forward, right? And that's exactly it. It's exactly what you said. I think the work of really be able to do that lateral work is to be able to actively really position ourselves regularly, especially when we're in the service space, especially when we're in the space where we're thinking about what support looks like, right? We need to actively regularly do that, both as individuals, but also as institutions, right? What are we as institutions? What are our histories, our institutions? How do we what histories are attached to our institution, how people then engage with that, right? So that's something that we regularly deconstruct, right? If folks, even within the community, don't see our organization as serving them either historically or one way or another, that's another piece, right? To really think about and deconstruct. And then what does it mean to actively reach out to places that are invisibilized, even within the demographic, right? So even when we think about Muslim communities, and we think about, NCCM as an organization that serves Muslim communities, so we need to regularly, actively think about which communities end up being invisibilized in our conversations, right? And if we're not actively doing that work, it's easy to do that, right? That is the default. There's an interesting metaphor that comes a Harvard professor kind of speaks about thinking about racism and what it means to kind of be anti-racist, do anti-racist work. He says really swimming against the current. That's really what you're doing when you're committed to the work of anti-racism. And swimming against the current, it's not easy, right? It's laborious, it's ongoing, right? We need to think about how do we take care of ourselves as we do that, but that's what it is, right? And often, even if you're not, actively swimming, in the direction of the current, right? Some folks are actively swimming in the direction of the current to, reinforce barriers. But even if you're not doing it, if you just are not actively thinking about that, you are reinforcing the structures that exist, right? So that is the work.
I love that metaphor, the act against or against the current. And also your conversation where you introduced being part of service, the service sector or service delivery, if we tie that with assumptions. And I think that's a very important piece to move forward with, that we assume because we're in a position we're actually doing the work of social justice. And in many ways, we're not countering, or we, in some ways, in some ways, we may be perpetuating the narratives that exist. So really thinking about, and this highlighted it for me, bringing ourselves back into the work and not just getting the work done, but being the work, which is I think, very powerful and something that we can all take away and move with from this conversation. And then I guess when it comes to other communities, I don't know if it comes up in the work under Islamophobia, or if you touched on it when we're thinking about, ability, disability trends, and homophobia, class, and language, at least having these conversations. How to begin to move toward really thinking about that existence within the Muslim communities, or Muslim communities, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think this work is hard, and the structures don't always enable us to do this. But in reality, if we think about what it means to serve a particular intersection, it's really thinking about what are the barriers constructed around the intersection in relation to another intersection, right? Because what ends up happening is particular things become amplified in specific intersections, right? And if we don't really understand that particular things are being amplified in a particular intersection, then we're not able to effectively serve that community or support that community, right? So when we're thinking about, again, Islamophobia, and we think about, the Black Muslim context, which is an interesting context that kind of lays that out, right? If we don't think about how, I was actually in a discussion around generally Islamophobia recently, and there was a lot of discussion had around surveillance. Right, the Muslim communities go through profiling and surveillance at the state level, at the borders, that happens regularly. And what does that do to communities, right? What does that do in terms of building trust within communities when you're constantly being surveilled in one way or another, right? And the surveillance is not visible to you, right? But at the same time, there was almost no discussion of policing at all, right, in that discussion. And then I'm like, where does this leave Black Muslim communities, right? Because yes, they are going through the everyday kind of invisible surveillance, right, that shapes them, but they're also going through very blunt, obvious policing that happens on the street, right? So for us to serve Black Muslim communities, we need to understand both of these things are happening at the same time. Then what does support look like? What does, know your rights, education sessions look like? We need to talk about surveillance, but we also need to talk about how do we engage with policing, right? So those are the pieces that require like the intentional surveying work of understanding the community at play and what pieces become amplified for that community.
Excellent. And thinking about policing and surveilling beyond the state, and how the state then mobilizes that through individuals. So that's a great point. And then another piece of your discussion focused on gendered Islamophobia, as well as gendered Black Islamophobia. And I think it's brilliant that you introduced this. And so the question I have is, this is a specific new focus. So I also believe that this was engaged, so yes, this is around gender. So a participant from a previous section or session also engaged with a question around Black women. And so I think we should highlight this in a practical way to think about the layered and compounded experiences and how it impacts folks' access to services and supports, including how they are delivered. And so the question really is, how can individuals and organizations begin to reflect on understandings of gender in the many intricate ways it exists? We did speak about this, but I also want to extend it to gender-based violence. For example, in the home, workplace, community, healthcare, and around customs, to support equity, anti-racism, and inclusion for Muslim communities. And I say this in thinking about the way in which customs and cultures are experienced or understood within the Canadian context.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this is an area that comes up often too, right? And in many ways is like when we're doing the service work and we're doing the support work, especially frontline work, right? And we're supporting folks around gender violence, whatever way it shows up, right? I think that the question happens is like, do we resort to universalist tropes to be able to explain what's happening, right? It's about the why. How are we explaining what we see, right? How are we trying to understand what we see, right? So when we see gender-based violence occurring, let's say in Muslim communities, how are we understanding that, right? How are we kind of figuring that out and dissecting, right? Versus when you see gender-based violence happening in a white family, how do we understand and dissect that, right? So there's, different dynamics happen, right? Automatically when we see gender-based violence in racialized communities, there's the racial tropes kind of follow, right? So it goes hand in hand. It doesn't become how do we understand that family's dynamic? How do we understand how certain customs come to be amplified, taken up a specific way, and lived up a specific way, right? So those are the pieces that come up, and often we're in discussion with folks that support gender-based violence. We always emphasize the idea that when we do gender, we need to think about the case specifically, right, without retorting to racial tropes. But at the same time, you need to think about gender-based violence much bigger. Patriarchy is a lot bigger than a particular cultural manifestation of it, right? So we have different cultural manifestations of patriarchy, but we know patriarchy cuts across. So we need to be able to have those frames, to be able to think about the why and what we see, right? And not just, again, swim towards the current and just kind of reinforce kind of, the racial tropes.
Yes, I love that. Thank you. And before we close off, I know we're nearing toward the end of our presentation. I do have, there's a comment in the chat, which I'll ask. So how does layering and socioeconomic circumstances affect the way we show up, and that's in quotations, to serve Muslim communities with respect and in consideration of the multiple intersections they already face?
Yeah, you can tell a lot from a question, right? And that question already shows there's been a lot of kind of reflection and thinking around the considerations we need to have in these conversations. So thank you for that question. Socioeconomic circumstances is another kind of layer that complicates the terrain, right? And again, it speaks to structural, systemic context, right? What is the context of entry, right? What is the context of entry in this land if we're talking about newcomers, right? That context in itself constructs our ability to move in the socioeconomic terrain in a very specific way, right? And then it layers the complications that we need. So that is an accurate question. It does layer it. And I think, again, it is the work of, it is that layered and difficult work of trying to draw the map of the folks that we're serving, right? And again, there's no kind of one size fits all, where we're located, we have particular levers, and to be able to push those levers, we need to do the hard surveying work, understand what are the particularities of the communities that we're serving, and then what does intervention look like specifically.
I like that. What does intervention look like specifically? So really, yeah. Thinking about listening, somebody had mentioned listening and in hearing people and then responding in a way that is specific to, the intervention is specific to your unique needs. And as you mentioned, people tell you what they need and what they're looking for. And so it's a matter of taking that and feeding that back into our work in our organizations, but also at the organizational level. Really, I say integrated instead of integrated, or integrate these experiences into our frameworks, into our strategies, and into how we confront and challenge systemic inequities that live within us and that live within our institutions and organizations. And the last piece I wanted to touch on, Nadiya, before we do wrap up, is this idea of perceived Islamophobia, which I think is incredible. It's an incredible position or space to engage with this work from. And so you mentioned perceived Islamophobia and other racialized folks who get pulled into the drama or this narrative of Islamophobia. And I think this speaks to more of anti-racism, anti-Black racism, where we see and we know that white passing or non-racialized identities within the Muslim community experience Islamophobia entirely differently, and it contributes to the larger conversation in unique ways. So I ask, how does this impact the conversation of Islamophobia and racism? And then, of course, how individuals and organizations can begin to confront and challenge these harmful and ill-informed or misinformed narratives.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, the perceived piece is big, because that also speaks to how Islamophobia ends up racializing Muslim communities, right? A particular racial trope ends up circulating around Muslim communities, right? Irrespective of its facticity, it circulates and it has power. So what that means often is even the way we think about what kind of supports around Islamophobia we need to put in place, it has to include also non-Muslim identifying communities, right? That may be picked up through these tropes, right? And may experience the harms of Islamophobia through these tropes, right? So that's another piece. And another layer to kind of think about there is that, what does it mean when we can think about, Muslim faith practices as a world sense, as a world view, as a way of orienting towards the world, right? We can think about Muslimness as a way of orienting towards the world that's informed by history, by faith-based practices, right? But what does it mean when a world view or world sense is made into a racial trope, right? Like, that's a really strange thing, right? Because then we, at the same time, we're thinking about faith-based practices, but the folks that are being pulled into the drama of Islamophobia don't engage in those faith-based practices, right? So that's what racial grammar is a strange thing, and the way it constructs difference, right? The dominant way difference is understood through kind of the lens of whiteness is through racial constructions, right? So racial grammars end up moving in ways that seem nonsensical, right? So if you're thinking a religious group is made into a racial trope, then what happens? Who's left out of that conversation? But also, who experiences the brunt of that violence? So we can have Muslim identifying folks that are white passing that do not experience everyday Islamophobia, right? But the other side, we have non-Muslims that fit a trope that experience a higher degree of Islamophobia, right? So that's the strange dynamic in when you racialize a faith-based practice.
Yes, and you mentioned in their proximity, and I guess another key point to remember is proximity to whiteness as we have these conversations, which has just been incredible. So Nadiya, I do want to thank you for this brilliant and insightful conversation or presentation, as many folks have mentioned, and it has been incredibly meaningful. So I do want to thank OCASI for organizing this webinar series. This is the final webinar series of racial equity, the series. And I want to thank you to everyone who participated in today's session, as well as previous sessions, including interpreters and translators. The session would not be what it was or is without you. And thank you, of course, Nadiya, for your insights and guidance through this conversation, as we may be coming to this for the first time, or engaging with this as in somebody who's living this experience, or who does this work. And you can learn more about Nadiya at their website. And then for any questions related to this presentation, please contact OCASI. It will be available online. There was a question around the slides. I am not entirely sure if the slides will be available to participants, but the recorded session will certainly be available for your viewing. And I've posted Nadiya's websites, personal as well as the organization website, in the chat. So folks, if you'd like to engage with her work further, please feel free to contact or get in touch with her this way. And there's one other question, Nadiya, before you go, or if you have anything to say. Somebody asks if we can learn about your future programs or sessions that you may be speaking at, and that folks can attend or refer others to attend?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so if you're following NCCM, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, we'll have, we have our sessions updated there. We also have a menu, a workshop menu to be able to do these sessions much more tailor-made for to particular organization if that's needed. So I would say kind of follow NCCM and you'll be in the know.
Thank you so much. And this concludes the webinar series, but the videos will be available to all participants if you would like to come back to this conversation. And I want to leave the space open for any final comments. I will remain on at least until 12:02.